But now we're going to make the journal card actually do something. So let's do that. There we go. So what we want to do here is on click, we want to create a new journal entry and then navigate to the editor page in which you can edit that journal entry. And all that needs to happen without asking the user for anything. So we're not going to show a mode of like, what's the name of your journal? Well, our journals don't have names. And I know that because we wrote the schema and they literally don't have names. So we don't need to ask for names. We don't need any information. And they don't have anything unique about them other than the IDs. So we could give them the same content as well as a starting point, which is exactly what we're going to do. So we're just going to make like a default journal entry that says like new entry. And from there, you can go and start editing it. So let's do that. First things first is we need to set up an on-click inside of our new entry card. How do we set up an on-click on a server component? Anybody know?
Is that use client thing?
Yeah, you can't. You have to make it a client component. So now we got to turn it into a client component. So if you don't know what this is, you actually do know what this is. It's every React component you've ever made in your entire life. That's what this is. Every component we've made up until this point was different. It was a server component. It tricked you. It made you think you were writing React components, but you were not. You were writing React server components. This is exactly what you thought it was. It's a regular React component. Now we can use hooks. We can do anything that you could have done in any React component. Whereas in something like entry card, you cannot write a hook in here. You cannot do any of that stuff. It's just not possible. The other thing is, because this is a client component, you cannot make this async. You cannot do that. That is not going to work. So everything has its own purpose. This is going to be a client component because we need interactivity. Interactivity requires JavaScript. JavaScript means it's going to run on a client. So let's do that. So on click, we want to be able to do something. So we'll say on click. We're going to, let's just make a function up here that says handle on click. Cool. And we'll just pass that here. So far, so good. So on click, we want to be able to make an API call and create a new journal entry. So it's a few things we have to do. One, we need an API to even hit to make a new entry. That's one thing. Two, we need a function that calls that API, right? So we got to make both of those. So let's start with the actual API, and then we'll come back and we'll make the function, and then we'll bring it in here, and we'll tie it all together. So to make an API, we just got to go into app/API, which we already have, and just make a new folder. And we're going to call this the journal folder. So it'll be /API/journal. And inside of here, if you make a route.ts, that's a very specific name. Just like you have to make a page and an API, you have to make a route file. This is saying I now have a route for a /API/journal. And inside this route, I want someone to be able to create something. Usually the HTTP verb for creating something is a post. So all I have to do here is just export a function called post with a capital letters. And this is going to allow me to accept, this is basically enabling /API/journal post, like a post request to that route. So for this route, I'm going to say, what do I need to create a journal? Let's look at the schema. I need a user ID. I need some content. I don't need an analysis. That's optional. So we're not going to ask the user for content, and it's not unique, so we can just make some content up, but we do need the user ID. So we need to get the user's information. Luckily for us, we already have a utility function for that, and it's called get user by clerk ID. This works in the API's function as well because we didn't explicitly say it, but this auth file is only being used on the server side. This is not being used on the client. If you try to use this on a client, it will for sure 100% not work because these are node modules. How do I know that? Well, because I know Prisma doesn't work on the client. I know this auth function was meant to work on the server from Clerk. There is a package you can install called server only to ensure your stuff only runs on the server. I'm not going to do that. You just import it and it basically will error out if you try to bring anything from this file into the client. It'll error out. Not to be confused with doing something like this, which is called use server. That's only useful for creating server actions, which I don't think we're going to be doing because I don't feel the need to. There's a lot going on there. I know it's very confusing, but that's just how it is. So anyway, we got the user, and now we want to be able to, create an entry. So let's do that. So we'll say entry equals 08. Let's bring in our Prisma dot journal entry dot create, like so. And then we want to create with this data. This data is going to be user ID. It's going to be user.id. You can do that. The other way you can do this is you can say user, pass in an object, say connect, pass in another object, ID, and then you can say user.id. You can do that too. This is like you specifically connecting this user to this entry. But why am I going to do all that when I can just do this? So I'm just going to do that. So we got the user ID. It's freaking out because it's like, hey, you forgot something. You're missing something. Content. You're missing content. So I'm going to add content. And every new entry is just going to have the same content. Write about your day. Something like that. This needs a comma. Cool. So we got that, satisfied all the needs there. We have our entry, and now we can just send this back with a return next response that you got to import from next server dot JSON. And I typically is always just send back an object with a data property with the data that I'm sending back. That's just how I've always done it. You can do whatever you want. I prefer to send back an object with the same key on it so I can have some predictable code on the front end that's looking for the same key. If I just send back the entry by default, that object's gonna have different keys on it. Another route's gonna have different keys on it. It's just better just to be like, I know that's gonna be on the data property. Let me just grab it. So, cool. Any questions on that? And also because the middleware is protecting all of our routes, we can also assume that you can't access this unless you're logged in as well, because the middleware won't let you. Cool. All right, so we got that. Now what we want to do is make a function that will call this API. So I'm going to go to my utils, make a new file. I'm going to call it api.ts. I'm going to make a new function here called create new entry, like so. And we're going to use fetch here, which is slightly modified version of fetch that Next.js modified. We don't need to worry about those modifications. But one big difference is that like fetch now uses the request standard object that's built into the web. So we'll be using that. So I'm just going to make a utility function that creates a URL for us. And remember, fetch, you can't pass in relative URLs. You have to pass in the full path URL, even on localhost. So I could just hard code that. I could just say HTTP localhost / whatever. But what about when I'm not on localhost, if it's hard coded? So I want that to be dynamic. So I'm going to make a function that dynamically does that. So I'll just say const create URL. And then that's just going to take in a URL path that you want. And then it's just going to return, let's just say, window dot location dot origin plus path. So because our API is always going to be on whatever website we're on / API slash whatever. So window.location.origin is always going to give you window.location.origin. It's always going to give you the full URL that you're currently on. And like no slashes after, right? So if I go to another website like here, it's just going to give me github.com. Cool. Okay, so we got that. Now we can go back to this function, create new entry, and I guess I got that backwards. There we go. What I was doing there. Now we can say const res equals await, make this async. This will be fetch. And then inside of fetch, I'm going to do a new request. Like this. Request takes in a URL. So the URL that I want is create URL like so with /API/journal. That's the route we just made. The second argument to request is an object for configuration. So method is going to be post, and then body is just going to be, we don't actually have to send anything up here because in our route, we already just hard code the default here. We don't even need to send a body here. But if you were to send a body, just make sure you JSON stringify it first. So stringify. Make sure you stringify like whatever thing you were going to send up here. We don't really need it. So just going to do that. And then I can say if res.ok, then return res, or actually I'll just say const data equals await res.json. So you gotta, that's a promise, and then I'll return the data .data because I always send back data. And if it's not okay, we're not gonna worry about errors right now. We'll do error handling later. I like to just do all my error handling at once, because then I found out that if I just piecemeal the error handling, it'll be different for every single function that I do. Whereas just creating like a unified error handling system with appropriate messages and status codes, you got to think about it like that, not just like, this is how I'm going to handle this function, and this is how I'm going to handle this function. It'll just be different everywhere you go. Like you got to take it as a system approach. So I like to think about that entirely and later. So we're good for now. All right, so we'll return that data. We have create new entry. This should work, hopefully, and let's go see what happens. Cool, so let's head over to our new entry card. On click, we will say async. Let's await, create new entry, like this. And we don't need to get the return value here. The reason we don't need the return value here is we can't do anything with it. There's literally nothing we can do. This component doesn't render all the entries on the page. So having access to that return entry here means nothing. You might say, well, what if we just had a function in here that we can call that says like, on click, and then we pass in the value there. Like, we can't do that because this new entry card component is being rendered in a server component here. And you can't pass functions as properties to server components and client components because they can't be serialized over the internet. So that won't work. So there really is no point of trying to get the return value of that API call. And you'll see we'll run into a UI problem where it's like the screen won't update until you hit refresh. And we'll talk about how we can fix that. But that's because we're fetching the data on the server in one place, and then we're updating the data on the client in another place. Whereas before, you probably use something like React, React Query or SWR, where you're mutating and fetching all in the same place on the front end. So you do want to get the return value and update the cache and do all this stuff. These two things don't share the same cache. We're literally getting data on the server, and then we're doing stuff on the front end. So it doesn't work that way. They don't know about each other. There's no JavaScript on the front end for this component at all. It's just HTML, whereas this component has tons of JavaScript on the front end. So cool. Okay, so we have that. And then after this, what we want to do is we want to do a redirect, but we don't want to use redirect. We want to use router. So we'll bring in use router from next navigation. And inside of here, we'll say router equals use router, like so. And then after we create this, we'll just say router dot push to /journal/ and we need the ID of the journal. So I guess in this case, we will get the data here only because we need to route to it, but not because we're trying to show it on the page. So like that. So router.push, the router is just I really like what Next.js is doing here. They're just abstracting around, they're just leveraging the web. They're like, there's already a good router in the web. Let's just make a wrapper around it. Use router. If you've ever used the HTML5 push state router, that's what this is. It's just a stack. It's just an array of routes, and you're pushing to it, which means go to it. And when you go back, you pop. Like it's very simple. So this is the equivalent of saying go here, right? So you could replace it if you wanted to, and basically it will go to it, and then it will replace the route that you're on now with this new entry. So when you go back, you won't go back here. You'll go back to one that's before this. So you're basically you're not creating a new instance, a new space in the stack. You're replacing the space in the stack. But we're not going to do that. That's useful for something else. Like if you had a modal attached to a route, and when someone hits back, you don't want them to go back to the modal. You want them to go back to the page before the modal. So you would do a replace, not a push. It's a lot to think about. Well, let's see what we broke. All right. Okay, so, well, if this works, for sure what's going to happen is we're going to get a 404 because we don't have that route set up for journal ID. So that's what we should see. So we click this. Oh, it worked. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. So you can see it got the ID here, and it went there, and it 404'd. And just to verify, like we always do, we can go to npx Prisma Studio, load that thing up, and click this tab here. And you can see we do have a journal entry now. And it has our default content, write about your day. Pretty cool. Any questions on that? Yes.
Could you show the create new entry thing in the utils API?
Absolutely. There you go. So basically what this is doing, it's passing a new, it's weird looking because I'm passing a function in another function in another function. So it's weird. I guess I could have not done it that way. But yeah, so this creates the URL, this creates the request, and this creates the fetch.
We don't need any credentials for the fetch because this is all happening on the server, right?
This is actually happening on the client. And there are credentials being passed. They're cookies. Cookies are passed automatically, so we don't have to manually pass them. Yeah, but I think Clerk also includes a JSON Web Token in the local storage that you can use yourself if you want to do that. But the cookies are being passed automatically, and then what's happening is the cookies are being passed automatically, which then, because the route that we're hitting is not protected, or it is protected right here, this middleware is checking that cookie. You'd be like, oh yeah, they're good to go. And then our function runs. So then our function comes here. This function then runs. And then there's another cookie check here where it checks the cookie, then it goes to Clerk, comes back with the user, and then our code runs. Yeah, there's a lot going on there.